Shalom, Rabbi Raysh Weiss here. We're preparing to enter into Shabbat haGadol, the Great Sabbath it's known as. And traditionally on Shabbat haGadol, rabbis would give extraordinarily long treatises on minutiae of religious practice. I'm sorry to disappoint, but right now I'm not going to be going into that quite. Instead, I'd like to think with you for a moment about what opportunities this coming Passover affords us in terms of its symbolic relevance in our lives today. Now, many of us are, of course, thinking and lamenting how our Seder this year is not going to look the way we had hoped it to look. We're going to be more isolated, it's going to be smaller, it's going to be more bare bones. But for some context about the original Passover, I want to remind us that the Seder night actually takes place the night before our ancestors fled from Egypt. If you look at the actual story in Exodus, we're talking about that night of the 10th plague, the plague of the firstborn, where the Israelites were actually instructed to take refuge, to quarantine themselves literally in their homes after they'd applied blood to their doorposts so that God would pass over their homes. And so I think many of us can relate to this moment, to this invisible but ubiquitous threat that's engulfing the world, our known world. And we can relate to this feeling that our ancestors must have experienced just on the eve of their redemption, not during their redemption. We're forcing ourselves to inhabit that mindset this year. The verse says, "None of you shall go out of your door of your house until morning." When the Lord goes through the land to strike down the Egyptians, God will see the blood on the top and sides of your doorframe and will pass over that doorway, and God will not permit the destroyer to enter your house and strike you down. Of course, the Passover ritual isn't just about quarantining ourselves inside our homes like our ancestors did on the eve of their redemption. It's about something much greater, something that can transcend the bounds of time and space. And that something is crafting a narrative which will endure for the generations. And the way we do that as Jews is we look to the story of our ancestors, that template of that original redemption, and we look to our own times. What kind of redemption do we envision for ourselves? How do we relate that to our own continuing story of the human people, of the Jewish people? And this is truly an act of both faith and trust in each other, in God, and in our commitment to the continuation of the world. The great Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas said once that believing in the Messiah isn't this kind of abstract eschatological messianism of the end of days, but rather it's a commandment for optimism. And so the Jews are an eternally optimistic people. And part of that optimism, I believe, is our penchant for questioning, which the Passover Seder so beautifully foregrounds in the very text of the Haggadah. Indeed, the rabbis talk about how it's actually a pedagogical failure when the parent turns to the child and has to have the child read from the text itself. In other words, we're supposed to be piquing the curiosity of our children such that they'll come up spontaneously with their own questions. And it's a model for life, it's a gift for life when we encourage and train our youth to ask questions, to look at the world with a critical eye, a critically loving eye, thinking about what is and what could be. That's the moment when we're able to ask questions, when we're no longer slaves to a situation. We may not be able to understand or control science right now. We may not be able to understand or control political leadership, but one thing we can do is we can think about what could be. We can force ourselves to learn. And that is a very truly Jewish mindset. So I wish everyone going into this Shabbat haGadol a Shabbat of peace and restoration, a Shabbat of learning and questions, and of course a Passover of being kind to yourself while also asking every question you need to ask and trying together to find those answers. May we see redemption, peace, and good health soon in our days. Amen, and Shabbat Shalom.